If you're only going to listen to a few seconds of this video, let there be at least one takeaway from this so you can correct people in a hopefully very pretentious way in the future. Frankenstein is not the monster. Okay, thank you. This video or episode will contain spoilers of the novel Frankenstein, but it's a novel still worth reading even if you know the plot. Also, I would hope it's a video still worth watching even if you didn't read Frankenstein and don't plan on reading it, since I will also discuss gender theory and existential crises, and the background of the novel is super interesting. The novel itself is also not really a typical horror or goth story. If it was, I probably would not have read and enjoyed it as much, to be honest, personally. Instead, it is a novel about loneliness and friendship, about empathy and anxiety, regret and purpose. It was itself written under the most romantic circumstances imaginable. Romantic not in the sense of romantic love, but the literary era of English Romanticism which this work is assigned to. It's a time in literature characterized by grand emotions, between crippling depression and sublime connection to nature, between societal upheaval and slow walks through a forest. It is in this sense that I say the circumstances were romantic, because they were definitely not what we would call a nice and cozy situation. Mary Shelley, the daughter of the early feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, which I mentioned in my video on Pierre Bourdieu, was married to Percy Shelley, a romantic poet. Mary Wollstonecraft was a revolutionary thinker and early critic of the difference in education men and women receive. She saw women's and men's rational capacity as equal and dependent on the fostering and education they received during their upbringing. I will say more about her later in this analysis though. In 1815, a volcano broke out in Indonesia. This eruption caused what is known as the Year Without a Summer, which inspired a beautiful painting by German painter Caspar David Friedrich and a pretty average poem by my younger self. In 1816, due to the climatic abnormalities caused by the eruption and volcanic ash in the atmosphere, a year went by with a fogged sky and no real summer, which for me personally would mean a year spent in depression. Well, during that time, Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley were staying with a pretty crazy squad at Lake Geneva. Members of the group were Mary's stepsister Claire Clement and famously Lord Byron, another English romanticist. So just imagine these people all together, very platonically hanging out in a harmonious way that was not impacted by Mary and Percy's baby dying right before the trip and Claire being pregnant with Lord Byron's child. Luckily, Mary Shelley was already 18, so at an appropriate age to handle this situation. So, they spent the time in a villa that Lord Byron rented, and when the weather became increasingly gloomy and rainy, they decided to hold a contest to pass the time. They resolved to each write a ghost story, which they could then read to each other to not feel as bored. And this is where Mary Shelley came up with Frankenstein. We start the novel with Robert Walton writing letters to his sister at home while on a scientific mission to the North Pole. He's deeply in want of a friend to share his thoughts and feelings with. In the lifeless environment of the North Pole, he and his crew rescue a man who is only a shadow of himself at that point. This man is Victor Frankenstein, and after Walton urges him to tell him about his story, Frankenstein finally gives in, and we are taken to the next level of narration, written down by Walton and corrected by Victor from the perspective of the latter. Frankenstein tells us everything about his life, his upbringing in a wealthy and educated family, and his interest for science from early on. He grows up in a family that is very close, almost shutting itself away from the outside world, content with the members of the family as their only companions. They do, however, let a few outsiders in their realm, importantly the girl that is promised Victor in marriage, his kind of stepsister cousin Elizabeth. They grow up together, but the family plans for them to get married once they are old enough. When Elizabeth gets sick with scarlet fever, Victor's mother enters her chamber a little too early before Elizabeth's recovery and gets infected. The mother dies due to the fever, leaving a hole in the family. It won't be the only tragedy happening to the Frankensteins though. Victor then moves to Ingolstadt to study there by wish of his father, and becomes obsessed with alchemy and alternative science, which everyone around him tells him is outdated and wrong. He shuts himself more and more away from society, and spends his day in a laboratory assembling dead body parts with the goal to create life on his own. Finally, he succeeds. He creates a monster 8 feet tall with black hair, yellow skin, black lips, and watery yellow eyes, which cause Victor to lose it. He abandons the creature immediately and ignores he ever created it. In the following, he falls sick and is nursed by his friend Henry Clerval. He then finds out that his youngest brother died by murder. A friend of his family is assassinated as the murderer, even though Victor knows it was the creature. This is where we enter the third level of narration and hear the creature's story, when him and Victor finally meet and talk. The creature describes his lonely upbringing and isolated self-taught education. It also describes how it was and is rejected continuously by society, and therefore only wishes to have an, importantly female, companion to live with in the wilderness. Victor first agrees, but then later destroys the female creature he created, causing the first creature to kill even more of Victor's loved ones. Victor's only goal at this point is to destroy the creature, and he chases it until the North Pole. Unsuccessfully, however. After telling this story to Walton, Victor dies and the creature resolves to kill itself in a fire. The plot sounds fast and packed, but it is actually Victor's thoughts of regret that haunt you, while the narrative pace of the novel is rather slow. It does not feel like a horror story, and I think literally every movie adaptation gets that wrong. I do like the movie Mary Shelley by Haifa al-Mansour, however. Nowadays, it is very difficult to separate the novel from everything that it has become. A pop cultural horror story where Frankenstein is often thought to be the monster. A story read as a warning against scientific ambition and the creation of life. A confused reproduction of gender roles by the very daughter of a feminist thinker. All of these perceptions depend on our present reading of the text, on what we want it to be, and also on how much we believe the narrators. How much would you believe a man at the worst point of his psychological condition, having lost almost all of his loved ones, with only a single thing left on his mind? Killing his own creation. How much would you believe a man haunted by loneliness on a mission to the North Pole that becomes obsessed with the story of a guy that repeatedly tells him nothing can save him anymore? How much do we believe Victor concerning what he tells us about his creation? Victor genders the creature and sets out to create a male being, but how do we know the creature is male? Judith Butler tells us about the performativity of gender. She describes how gender norms are ingrained into our society by iterability and power structures. Iterability means the reproduction of these norms, which then is also shaped by the cultural taboos and expectation limiting them. Of course, it is not a singular person that shapes what is seen as male or female behavior and performance. Instead, the very subject itself is produced by the repetition of these norms. Our identity is shaped by our gender and our action, which exists within these norms. We have so much knowledge about gender norms from early on in our childhood, not meaning that we question them or see them as norms, but in the way that we learn all of these behaviors and identify them so easily. I remember from a very young age in my life having a specific feeling that I could not really describe until I read this passage by Margaret Atwood in The Robber's Bride. Let me read that for you. Quote, "Even pretending you aren't catering to a male fantasy is a male fantasy. Pretending you're unseen, pretending you have a life of your own, that you can wash your feet and comb your hair unconscious of the ever-present watcher peering through the keyhole in your own head, if nowhere else. You're a woman with a man inside watching a woman. You are your own voyeur." Unquote. I think the creature is very interesting to be analyzed under these two aspects, gender and the gaze. The creature comes into this world as a tabula rasa, a blank page to be formed and shaped by its environment. In theory, it would have the potential to break out of any norms. It is the first and last of its kind. However, instead, the creature reproduces everything that is flawed within this patriarchal environment. It is gendered as a male by Victor and accepts this gender. Abandoned by its creator, it learns everything about the world on its own and is introduced into human affairs through the De Lacy family that he secretly lives with for some time. It learns about empathy and moral and love from them by observing and coexisting with them. However, it also more and more internalizes the gaze of its creator and the humans around it, the rejection of itself because of its appearance. In that way, the monster is actually an empathetic, intelligent being trapped within a body that is perceived differently by its environment. As I mentioned before, Mary Wollstonecraft famously criticized how the female identity is so connected to appearance and superficiality. Women are mostly taught to take care of their appearance, while men have to foster their intellectual education for the creation of identity and meaning. Wollstonecraft argues that men and women both possess rational minds, but she must have still suffered from a lot of rejection towards her ideas due to her being a woman. Same as Mary Shelley. I therefore feel like this trapped mind of the creature in a body that is rejected by society can somehow be the feeling of a highly educated young woman in a world that very often focuses on her appearance instead of her achievements and intellect. If you also feel trapped in your own body, consider subscribing to this channel. No, I'm kidding, but yeah, please do think about it. Back to the monster's identity creation with the de Lacys. Importantly, the creature also starts reading specific literary works, which some say to have also shaped its masculine performance. It reads Milton, Plutarch, and Goethe, and just imagine the feeling of reading Sorrows of Young Werther as a being so haunted by loneliness and so rejected by the world around it that no words could ever express this solitude. The monster thereby slowly constructs its masculine identity, and within this lies the need for a heterosexual relationship, of course. Just think about that. The female sphere is dependent in its very existence on the male need for it. The monster encounters William, the younger brother of Victor, with the intention of making him his companion. However, he sees the portrait of William's mother in the locket around the child's neck, and everything changes. Within the story of a being only actively learning about the norms of our society, it is immediately assumed, either by Victor as the narrator or by Mary Shelley as the author, that the creature is moved by the female beauty. This is where its idea of a female companion arises. We are presented with a world in which the necessity for the female only exists out of the wanting of a male. As Judith Butler further analyzes, the gendered expectations between creator and creature are then further increased after this wish. With the law of the father, Victor gives in on promising the creature a female companion. This is an agreement between two men deciding about the future of a woman, often fostering kinship between them. In this case, in the novel, however, it is just an agreement so the monster stops accidentally or intentionally killing Victor's family members. The monster gives up on finding friendship and love within the human world, as it is constantly rejected by it. However, it wants to create a parallel existence, mirroring the conditions in the human world, with the heterosexual relationship at its core and only necessity. This, again, makes the creature so dependent on its flawed creator, since it seems to think that this kind of relationship would bring it happiness and fulfillment. In the reality of the novel, however, marriages are not considered an important source of connection and love. It is instead male friendship that seems to be the center of a mutual and spiritual relation to others. The marriages that are presented in the novel seem such unideal cases that it becomes more and more certain how Mary Shelley waves in her criticism of society throughout the novel. The marriage between Victor's parents is not one of equals, but of a weak woman being saved out of poverty by her then husband. She is a caring mother and stepmother to Elizabeth. In fact, she cares so much that she dies because of her overly selfless love for Elizabeth. This might also be an autobiographical processing of how Mary Shelley's mother died in the days after giving birth to a daughter, literally giving her life to her. In the novel, the motif of companionship feels very important and might connect with Mary Shelley's own deep longing for connection. In 1823, she writes in her diary, quote, "I once dreamt that the thoughts laboring in this brain might shape themselves to such words that might wave a chain to bind the thoughts of my fellow creatures to me in love and sympathy. But it is not so." Unquote. After reading this, I can now imagine how she came up with the passages from the perspective of the creature. She might also derive this preference of men for the male friendship from observing the intimate conversations between Lord Byron and Percy Shelley. Within their discussions, she describes herself as a devout but silent listener. In the novel, all important figures seek the male friendship for sharing their thoughts. Walton is the one most openly expressing these feelings, and his lack of connection is the hole that is later filled by Victor's story. Walter encounters a quote-unquote wretched man, having caused the deaths of multiple people, but he does not care about that. All he wants is to find someone to talk to. It doesn't matter that Victor is not seeking friendship at all at this point, having given up on any hope for improvement. Victor's whole downfall into obsession is also deeply related to his lack of community in Ingolstadt. While before he was protected within his family, he now lost his mother and the safety of his home. I think we should not imagine Victor as a mad scientist longing for success and overcoming the boundaries of nature. I think he's a person deeply dependent on the companionship of others and unable to be on his own. Victor himself says that, quote, "If no man allowed any pursuit whatsoever to interfere with the tranquility of his domestic affections, Greece had not been enslaved. Caesar would have spared his country. America would have been discovered more gradually, and the empires of Mexico and Peru had not been destroyed." Unquote. This is such an interesting idea within the context of science and creation. For him, the need for such outward discoveries only emerges out of a disturbance within the domestic sphere. If no one ever left their perfect households, there would be no need for him to get obsessed with the creation of a monster. I say obsessed because his process of creation is far from a rational one. Victor literally is imprisoned by his own mind, perceiving his laboratory as a cell he himself created and forces himself to be in. Later, he is again trapped by his haunting feelings of regret and anxiety, which to me define the middle part of the novel. He not once in the months of creating the monster thinks about what he will do once he succeeds. Does he want a friend dependent on him that he has power over? Does he want to replace his dead mother? Or does he want to eternize himself without the help of a woman? For many readers, the novel criticizes Victor's hubris to play God and create life in an unnatural way. But is that really the case? When we read the novel, we actually deeply empathize with the creature. When hearing its perspective, we can imagine its loneliness and feel impressed by its intellect. The monster is by far the most eloquent and well-read character in the novel, and finds itself in a helpless situation we can only feel sorry about. Is it therefore really the creation of such a being that Shelley criticizes? I would say it is not. It is the abandonment, the lack of responsibility of Victor, that is the actual problem. If we go a step back, we see this motif even before the real creation. As I said before, Victor's obsession down-spirals after the death of his mother and him leaving his family home. He turns to this project as a result of the idea of his father that men should pursue a certain kind of education, leaving the domestic sphere. But leaving it without having learned how to foster a healthy environment from within and live the values of care and companionship that he took for granted at home. The same, I would say, goes for Walton. Personally, I do not think Walton is an obsessive science guy that only wants to learn more about the North Pole. As he describes, he before wanted to be a poet and did not in his eyes succeed. During his whole trip, he is far more concerned with finding a friend and his loneliness than he is talking about his scientific project. That could, however, also be because he's writing to his sister, and obviously women would never understand scientific things like that. Walton writes, quote, "But I have one want which I have never yet been able to satisfy, and the absence of the object of which I now feel as a most severe evil. I have no friend, Margaret. When I am glowing with the enthusiasm of success, there will be none to participate my joy. If I am assailed by disappointment, no one will endeavor to sustain me in dejection." Unquote. What I would say about Walton is that he is a man haunted by the societal expectations to create an identity out of external achievements. He is torn between the domestic sphere assigned to women and the public world which he feels he has to conquer. I say this because I feel like what really defines Walton is his enthusiasm and clinging to things that fill up his time and give him purpose. He doesn't really want to go to the North Pole or be a poet. He wants something to fill this spot in his identity. He doesn't really want to be Victor's friend. He wants someone to fill this hole in his heart. The real critique by Mary Shelley, in my opinion, seems to be the stark division of male and female spheres and the suffering caused by it. Victor's mother dying due to her being completely swallowed up by the role of a caretaker. Walton and Victor urgently seeking something they can create meaning from, when they really only seek human connection. So why does Victor abandon the monster? Victor looks at the creature and describes his facial features almost in awe, but when he looks into its yellow, watery eyes, he cannot take it anymore. He realizes that he has in fact created a living being, looking back at him, an external self looking into his own eyes. Human eyes are actually evolutionarily made to create empathy and connection, since we have a wide sclera that allows others to notice exactly where we are looking. We also see ourselves in the other, because the pupil reflects our image. By that, we become at the same time aware of our connection to the other and our insurmountable separation. In this moment, Victor realizes that he has to assume responsibility for another being, a trait he only ever observed in women around him. Before looking into the creature's eyes, he was only concerned with how the creature apparently owed him gratitude for creating it. He says, quote, "A new species would bless me as its creator and source. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs." Unquote. What the novel therefore condemns is, again, the separation of the public and the domestic. With this harsh split, science is a matter of masculine ambition, focused on the creator himself, his success and his feeling of superiority over nature. Care of others, however, is a feminine trait, taken to the extreme in a negative way if women are bound to the domestic like Victor's mother. If this separation is supposed to work, it can only function if both stereotypical powers are present at the same time. On one level, this is what Shelley criticizes and what Victor lacks. On top of that, he doesn't even realize his actual mistake, and spends the whole time in agonizing regret of having created the monster. He's unable to break out of the things he learned in the patriarchal society. Therefore, Shelley's critique goes even deeper, as the very condition for these events happening are already dysfunctional. She therefore not only reproduces the gender norms by saying that Victor lacks inherently feminine traits of care, but instead shows the horrible events this separation led to from the start. In my opinion, this interpretation is strengthened by what I talked about before, the male friendship. If there's one good and functional thing in this novel, it is probably Victor's friend Henry taking care of him. This shows the potential of what can be achieved if male care is fostered on a societal level. We also see this need for abolition of binaries in the contrast of Victor and Walton as scientists. During his time of working on the creature, Victor loses all touch with reality and doesn't even keep contact with his family anymore. He gets completely lost in the process and neglects social contact altogether. Walton, however, continuously writes to his sister, even when he's cruising around on the freaking North Pole, seeking contact and exchange with others. Walton would never get to this point of complete obsession, in my opinion, as his very want for scientific discovery depends on others. Like he said before in the quote, he wants someone to be there when he succeeds. Yeah, I just think Walton is really sweet somehow. Another dysfunctional aspect of Victor's treatment of the creature is his assertion of power over it. He marginalizes the monster and silences it actively from his life by literally trying to ignore it ever existed. When he then does present the creature's own perspective, he mentions multiple times how we should not believe it, again taking away credibility and dignity from it. Most importantly, the creature never even gets a name. It is not even given the most basic necessity for identity formation in this world, and Victor possesses all power over this aspect of it. Again, the monster mirrors the female experience in a patriarchal world, being silenced and pushed away. Women's last name disappear with the marriage, and women are often described as seductive and manipulative, just as a creature. In reality, this is an attempt of patriarchs like Victor to push away the confrontation that comes with their existence, reminding them of their own weaknesses. Mary Shelley herself, however, did not turn away from her children like the masculine figures in her text. However, she did observe the men around her doing so, like Byron during The Year Without a Summer. She herself must have experienced this severe feeling of dread and anxiety surrounding birth, as she had 3 of her babies die and 1 being born dead, all of this before she even turned 27. So how did she weave in her own voice, as a young woman, into this story about male protagonists and stereotypical side character women? Her novel is the pendulum between 2 extremes. On the one hand, it seems impossible for the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft to write a fully patriarchal novel. Mary Shelley adored her mother and her work, and was very influenced by it. Actually, she used to go on pretty slay dates with Percy Shelley, sitting at her mother's grave and reading A Vindication of Women's Rights together. On the other hand, she of course is a product of her time and might actually have specific internalized gender norms that intuitively shape her when coming up with the idea of what a novel looks like. She was also very young when coming up with the story. It would make sense for the novel to just be that way, don't get me wrong. It is sometimes pointless to try to read something feminist into every piece of literature we can find, and I agree with that. But still, the book seems so intentional, so crafted and thought through. She revised it for much of the 1820s, growing up with it as a person and bringing in more of her life experiences. This is why I do think it is fruitful to put a feminist perspective to her writing. One thing that I already mentioned is how by presenting all these stereotypical elements but letting them collapse more and more, she displays the inherent flaws to the reader. Community would protect scientific ambition from becoming detached from responsibility. Education focused on inner traits would protect women and the creature from marginalization and loss of identity. The creature also seems to be the character that most closely reflects the position of Mary Shelley as a female writer at that time. It establishes its identity through assimilation and reproduction of the existing order. Even when dreaming of creating a different life for itself, this life only mirrors the patriarchal world of the 18th century. However, even this assimilation attempt does not fully work, as the creature is still rejected by others and never able to be a part of a community. It personifies a struggle described by Carol Kahn in the following, quote, "If we refuse to learn the language, we are virtually guaranteed that our voices will remain outside the politically relevant spectrum of opinion. Yet, if we do learn and speak it, we not only severely limit what we can say, but we also invite the transformation, the militarization of our own thinking." Unquote. Mary Shelley is torn between using the same language and tropes that patriarchal society offers, or breaking out of it, which would explain why her criticism can be so hard to detect. It is covered by a learned language of binaries and oppression, such as the creature only ever learns to express itself within the very system that oppresses and rejects it. This goes back to the quote by Atwood from before, describing the incapability to break out. Personally, I do want to give this an optimistic touch and acknowledge how much we have already achieved in terms of changing the language our identities are written in. Even though the process of establishing ourselves in this world, catering to a specific type of human being, can be tiresome, I'm so thankful for women like Mary Wollstonecraft and Mary Shelley that have fought this fight in way more difficult times. If you enjoyed this analysis, please consider subscribing or recommending this video to someone that you know, and if you have time, even leaving a comment with your thoughts on the novel. That would be very interesting for me. Thank you for listening.